Huzzah! To the lords and ladies listening, verily I say unto ye, welcome to a bonus Chapo Trap House episode for all the serfs and peasants who listen to the show. You are hearing this transmission from Castle Trap House, and we are joined by the filmmaker Lance Oppenheim to talk about his extremely funny new HBO narrative nonfiction documentary series, Ren Faire. Lance, I say unto ye, welcome.
Wow, I like that. Narrative nonfiction. That's a nice. HBO should have used that when they talked about the show. I steal it from you.
Well, Lance, let's start there. So, I mean, what I want to get at is like just a broad question about you as a filmmaker, and to paraphrase Werner Herzog when he was talking about making documentaries or yelling at people at a documentary film festival for the documentaries they made. Do you see your work as a documentary filmmaker? Are you the fly on the wall or the bee that stings?
I'm like the mosquito that sucks the blood, I guess, of the people that allow me to be there, and then we paint together with the blood. And no, I don't know. No, I'm definitely not a fly on the wall. But you know, I feel like sometimes it's sort of like it's interesting. I don't know. I don't consider myself this, but I was. One of the subjects of the documentary was interviewed in like Vanity Fair yesterday, and she compared us to like nature documentarians that would kind of move out of the way for our own safety, and we will help the creatures out of the way of the cheetah. But if the cheetah is in the line of, you know, a fucking, I don't know, a mountain lion, can a mountain lion take a cheetah? Is my analogy working? Then you know, we're not going to deviate from reality either, and we'll be there to soak up whatever happens. It's a dance at the end of the day, you know?
Sometimes a gazelle is going to get taken down and eaten on film. But for those who haven't seen the film, you dive into the world of the Texas Renaissance Fair, and you capture a sort of a Shakespearean power struggle. And a figure in King George, who is the creator of the Texas Renaissance Fair and its quite literal king. You have discovered a character and a setting that becomes something of a stand-in for contemporary all of America in the year 2024. So I just want to begin with, like, could you tell us, like, how did you come across this story, and like at what point did you realize the gold mine that you had happened upon, or was this planned from the beginning?
It was definitely not planned from the beginning, but I guess in 2021, in like November 2021, a journalist named David Govey Herbert and his story researcher Abigail Rowe, they reached out to me with sort of an outline of a potential promise that could be found at the Texas Renaissance Festival, specifically within this individual, George Coulam. And I thought they made up everything that was on the fucking page. I didn't think it was real at all. And I was curious if sort of the narrative nonfiction work of David as a great journalist would not. I was skeptical that could necessarily translate to the screen, and so I accepted the invitation to go with them to the Renaissance Fair. And I'd say about 2 days into being there, we had learned that George was still around, because that was a question, was whether or not he was alive. And then as soon as we met him, I knew that whatever we were going to do there would result in something hopefully better than I probably would have ever imagined. And I think that really at the end of the day comes back to George being the kind of magic man, terrifying Noel Cross meets David Lynch. I don't fucking know. You know, he lives in the Hobbit's version of the Playboy Mansion. You know, it's like it's its own
very
fucking
much
world.
like his,
you know,
his Kubla Khan, a stately pleasure dome to create. Yeah. So, like, you have sort of three principles in this movie. You've got King George and the two men who have like been given their lives to the Renaissance Fair, who are vying to potentially inherit this kingdom from him. But I want to know from you, like, what do you see in your three principal characters as like or as being kind of stand-ins for contemporary American culture? Like, what, like, do you see in George like a reflection of America in its twilight years?
Well, I think when we first started this, I didn't. But as you know, we spent 3 years there and shot like 110 days. I think that the things started to reveal themselves in ways that I hadn't thought of. And so, yeah, I mean, in a way, this story ends up becoming kind of like I don't know, like a portrait of the American Empire in decline. When our leaders are probably above the age where they should be leading anything, and yet you know they can't give up the thing that they helped create and mold. And in a way, maybe no one can be as magical or really have the wherewithal creatively to think outside the box and like they did. And so, I mean, I guess going back to the question, though, yes. I mean, I think George certainly resembles to me, like so many of our leaders today. That it's a guy who can't, who's clinging on to the only thing that's giving him power and meaning in his life. And then I think everyone else around him, I think, because that's really what the story ends up becoming. It's less about Renaissance festivals and I mean, it ends up becoming about a fantasy, but not the one that you pretend to be a part of. I guess if there's any fantasy that they're pretending to be a part of, it's the one where they could be king. And that's really what the story's about. It's about power and proximity to power and what power can do to you when you have it and what it can do to you when you don't, but you so desperately want it. And I think Jeff, the general manager of the fair, right? He's a dude who's kind of a traditionalist, loyal to a fault, maybe. You have Louie, who is a futurist and a capitalist, who is very much thinking about how to take what's there and build it into something new. He's thinking about bringing EDM festivals and making a Renaissance university, whatever that means, on the grounds of the fair. And then you have Darla, who's sort of the blend, the fusion between those two things.
Can I ask a detail about this that, I think came through in different ways? Do you consider the Texas Renaissance Festival well run on like a day-to-day basis?
I think in spite of George, it is well run. I think if you were to go there, you would never know that anything of like outside of the ordinary was happening. But I think it's a question that's interesting. I mean, the place makes so much money every year. I think Darla says this. It succeeds in spite of George. But the thing that's interesting about like a business like this is it's somewhere between like a fucking circus and like a theater troupe and like a summer camp and then like a multi-million-dollar, intense hyper-capitalist machine. And so I think that was like, to me, probably the reason they even let us make the film there in the first place was because all the people that were running the business were compulsively performing and and probably looking for an outlet, looking for a way to express themselves outside of the rumors and gossip that travel among everyone, and outside of a Facebook post that they could post later on about being terminated from their position inevitably, because that's what happens when you're in the back office there.
To that end, did you have any experiences with Renaissance fairs or these kind of like live action role playing, like sort of immersive imaginary zones of kind of play and capitalism? Like, did you attend any Renaissance fairs, or was this your first experience with a Renaissance fair?
I had been, I'd never gone to a Renaissance fair, but I grew up in Florida and, around the culture of people who would go to them all the time. And a lot of my very close friends from high school were Rennie heads. That I grew up about like 50 minutes away from maybe even further away from the closest Renaissance fair. So I spent most of my time growing up just at home. I think the thing that it reminds me of, or at least just the way I was trying to engage with it stylistically, was not dissimilar, I guess, from the way I was making the Villages movie, Some Kind of Heaven.
I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, because it's that's another place that's sort of like a kind of a manufactured,
a fantasy dream representation of the past, where people can immerse their whole lives in and kind of to escape the present day.
God damn! Look at that.
Of somebody, yeah.
You got it better than I did. No, that's exactly what it is. And both the founder of the Villages and the founder of the Renaissance Fair were both extremely inspired by Walt Disney. And in both movies, there's even a section where they both name check Walt Disney and the fucking book that Walt Disney bought. I think like Disney as a purveyor of this whatever America we've inherited. I think like it's not just with these theme parks or the Disneyfication of death, but it's everywhere. You go to a strip mall, or you just go to like any place really. It's seemingly in Texas, where the land developers govern the land that they've built. You know, that's Disney written all over it.
Not to get too far off topic, but did you watch the 4-hour Jenny Nicholson docu YouTube about the failure of Disney's Star Wars park?
I did. I thought it was brilliant.
So did I.
I think she's brilliant.
I mean, it doesn't surprise me that you watch that either, because I feel like that trades in kind of the same thing of being like, she's probably even more generous with like really actually coming from a place of wanting it to be good. But yeah, it's still kind of tracking that, like, how do you construct this false reality that allows people to indulge in it in a successful way, and how the ways that Disney failed under its own metric. I don't know. I think there's a kinship between the works there.
It's amazing. I mean, I think what she does is like a very specific type of like filmmaking. It's like a different, in a way, it's like vlogging and Adam Curtis, and also like, the fascination with American escapism. I think it's amazing. I loved that thing.
On the subject of American escapism, I mean, I think there's a certain reading of the Ren Faire community, or just like, or the broader sort of like these fantasy universes, be they Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings, these sort of fantasy representations of the past, that I think people read into it that like it's some sort of like a subconscious reactionary yearning to be dominated by the social relations of an earlier time period, a pre-capitalist time period. But what I really got from your movie is that everyone who goes to the Renaissance Fair is seeking escape from the social relations of today. Not necessarily that they're being replaced with like feudalism, but like that everyone wants to be the king. And one of the things Chris told me is that at the Renaissance Fair, when you attend the Renaissance Fair, no matter who you are addressed by the people who work there as my lord or my lady. And I'm just wondering, like, what do you make of this fantasy past and like people's need to inhabit it, or like what need are people seeking to fulfill in the Renaissance Fair?
Well, I think there's like there's a way to leave everything behind when you go and you enter the gates of a fair, right? I think that's sort of the outside of just the feudal dimension of it, or being addressed by the master of your own universe. I think there's just an ability you can have to just transform and become someone else. It's, to me, at least, I relate to that same sense when I watch a good movie, where I just forget about all the fucked up shit that's going on in my life that's giving me stress or grief or whatever, and I just lose myself in the experience of whatever it is that's playing before me. I think the thing that ends up happening in this story is, I think the setting is the promise of escapism is there, but the thing that ends up happening that I thought was really interesting is, like, no matter how far away you go from the confines of a traditional business or whatever it is, or even like, I feel like in some dimensions, there's a way you could see the fair and the way that this cycle and the promise of being king and the way that keeps people there. There is a dimension that is cult-like, or at least there's a cult of personality. I think the thing that's interesting and sort of about this exact story is that the same things that they're all pretending to be a part of, this sort of fiefdom or this feudal way of existing, it is playing out in their real lives. And so in that sense, there is no reenactment to what they're doing. Like the performances they're giving in the documentary, but also in, when they're in costume, is an extension of the drama that is reminiscent, I guess, of the same fucking feudal politics that would go on during the Renaissance period, where you had a king and you'd have to deal with that person, and you'd have to, play the game to get in his good graces.
All the world's a stage.
Yeah. I have a follow-up on that, because I understand that it might have been streamlined just for the narrative, but at any point in this, as you were filming, did any of these people consider or like threaten to just walk away, or did, between Jeff and Louie and Darla, or was that a given that they were completely enthralled to the fair, that they were going to just be there forever as long as they would be allowed to?
The latter. And I think that was the thing that also struck me as like a reason to tell the story, is that Jeff has been there for 43 years. Louie's been there for over 2 decades. Darla was the newest there, but I think because she was new, she thought she would be able to succeed in a way that no one else had before. But it's a fool's errand ultimately, right? And I think it's not just a story specific to this Renaissance Fair. I think, again, when you zoom out and you look at the rest of culture, I think, we hope that we are the people that are going to inherit the great institutions that have been created well before our time. And you hope that you can befriend the founder of those places and rub your shoulders against someone who, is a magical thinker, is a magic man of that time period. But what you don't really realize is that you aren't the chosen one. You probably realize that too late, after your life has been wasted by them. And eventually there's just nothing but it's just a barren wasteland of your of your soul and your life, and empty dreams that will never be fulfilled. And so it's much easier to keep playing the game, because you hope that the next cycle, the revolution of the cycle, will result in your favor. And I think that's really where the tragedy, I think, comes in of the story. I thought we were going to make something funny. I thought it was going to be a comedy, and it became a fucking tragedy by the end.
It's still pretty funny by the end, as heart wrenching as some of it may be. But Lance, like what you just said about the cycle of waiting for the next turn of events that will shine kindly on you, or perhaps it will be better next year. I think it is so fortuitous that this series was released during this current election year, because, like, look, we can talk about whether King George is a villain or a sort of a strange American hero, but for me personally, by the third and final episode of this, I was, like much of America is now during this presidential election, fondly hoping that this guy would just drop dead. Because I was really thinking, like, these people need to be liberated from this capricious tyrant. And it's a feeling very similar to watching Trump and Biden on TV. Is I'm just waiting for the Grim Reaper to just calmly put their hand on the shoulder. Yeah, just do your job. But as to the question of whether you can rub shoulders with the Magic Man, you can indeed rub shoulders with King George, provided you are a woman in her 20s with big naturals. And I can't stress the importance of that enough. Big naturals. I'm wondering, for the depiction of King George on the many, how shall we put this, dates and dating opportunities that he is provided with over the course of your filmmaking, did George portray any, self-awareness or shame about these arrangements that he was seeking?
No. And I think that's sort of one of the things that make him such a compelling, not just a documentary subject, but also as a person. He lives without any sense of humiliation or, I guess it was interesting when I showed him the first episode. I was very nervous, and I remember HBO. We all were like, "Is he going to react poorly to this? What's going to happen?" There were a bunch of people that were also around George that were saying, this thing's coming out and you have no editorial control and you signed a release, and oh my God, what the fuck's going, And I remember when we showed it to him, he started mouthing the words that he was saying on screen, and he just started laughing, even in the most like I would think moments that would make me feel squeamish, and they do make me feel squeamish, even though I'm not George. When
Yeah.
He loved them, he delighted in them, he laughed and laughed and laughed, and I think it made me in some ways have a greater appreciation for him in a certain way. Like I see that in the first episode when he's talking about his basic toilet paper dispenser, or when he's talking about his basic shower and you don't have to have a shower curtain with it. These are jokes to him. These are things that are and this is a practice. You're listening to someone who sees himself in a way as a trickster or a comedian. I think when it goes on and as it gets a little nastier by the end, and he reveals a side of him that's always been there, that lays dormant, but he reserves for people who mess up on things. And you see that there's the thing that he ultimately derives the most pleasure from is not sex or the chase of sex or even money, but it's the pain of others. That's the thing that he enjoys the most. He enjoys punishing people, and there's a specific smile that emerges on his face when he does it. Does that mean he's a horrible, evil person? I mean, I don't think evil exists in this planet. I spent enough time with public defenders and attorneys. I like to hew closer to how they see the world, which is that people are capable of horrible things and good ones. And I think for George, it's like the Freudian dimension of his relationships with women and his mother. And I mean, I think there's a reason he is the way he is. Not to be armchair fucking Freudian.
Well, he literally brings up his fear of castration at one part in the series, so you don't need to get too far off the armchair to psychoanalyze him.
I mean, not to get too spoilersy in this, if you haven't seen it, go watch the show. But do you think George really had any intention, or ever has any intention, of selling the fair, or is it all just a big game of playing with these individual people for his own amusement? Like, as you said, he gets his real enjoyment from inflicting pain. Is he making his own show to watch?
I don't think he's aware of the game he plays. I think he just enjoys it because he operates, it's pure id, and he is a hedonist. That's what he told me when I met him. All he does is he pursues pleasure. That's all he wants. I think, I fell prey to the same thing that everyone in the show fell for. I thought he was going to sell it. I thought he wanted to get rid of it. I thought that maybe the cycle that we were documenting was going to be the one that changed everything, and that this would be sort of the reason to tell this specific story right now. And then when it went the other way and it remained sort of frozen, and exactly the story ends exactly the way it begins, it became something much deeper to me, actually, and it became something that was a lot sadder, more tragic, maybe. The thing that's interesting is that this morning, actually, this is news, I guess, but
exclusive.
George watched the show and he was so obsessed with the Shrek the Musical moment when Jeff was singing Shrek the Musical.
Oh my God,
he was so obsessed with that song.
That was my favorite scene in the series. But when he was obsessed with the scene or just the song from Shrek the Musical?
I think the song and the expression of emotion that he gave Jeff his job back this morning. He stepped down from being general manager, George himself.
Wow.
He cleared the office and he fucking gave Jeff his old job back. And what is Jeff doing now? In 2 weeks, apparently he's supposed to be being sent by George to India to go to a chocolate convention. And so the cycle
if you watch
continues.
The show, that is the perfect joke of what is going on. Oh my God.
Jeff has some amazing lines on the show. The one of them that really stuck with me from the first episode is speaking of his ambitions to take over and become king of the Renaissance Fair. He says, "There are so many billionaires in the world, but relatively few self-made kings," which I thought was such a perfect distillation. And then in episode 2, he says, "If you serve the king, he'll be benevolent." And despite despite the fact that George makes him fire his wife and then fires him, it is actually quite heartening to hear that what goes, eventually, if you are loyal to the king long enough, his beneficence will eventually shine on you before he takes it all away. And to that point about taking it away and power, and what you said, that this is a show about what power does to people. I was struck by that George as a character. It's his need for control and control over everything that I think really defines him. And as this figure of a king in America, with through money and private power, you can accrue for yourself these little fiefdoms. And I think a big answer to the question of why George is the way he is that the only people he interacts with of a day work for him and are dependent on him entirely. And I think that really, I think that goes a long way towards explaining his behavior. And there is a part about how he sort of pushes away people who actually were his friends or family, that were people who were once close to him, so that he is only surrounded by his literal serfs, by people who want something from him, that need a paycheck from him, or are enthralled to him in some way.
His vassals.
Yeah.
His loyal vassals.
And I'm just I want to tease out this idea of control, whether it is in his Renaissance Playboy Mansion reality that he's crafted for himself, or back to the example of the residents of the villages in Florida. It's this need to immerse yourself in control and be in control of every interaction that you have with other people and having it be on your terms. And it's sort of money is the way that we allow people to do that in this country. And do you see a through line in your work of this idea of the sort of dying American need for control over everyone and everything?
Oh yeah, 100%. It's a beautifully put. I mean, I think for me, the first time I made it, I traced it back even further, because there was a film I made that was set. It it's called The Happiest Guy in the World. It's a short documentary I made a long time ago, but it's about a guy who left everything behind to live on a cruise ship. He lives on the Royal Caribbean Enchantment of the Seas, and he's been living there. When I met him, he was there for 20. He was living there on it was his 20th year of being there, and he left everything behind. He had no apartment. He disappeared from his life, his family, his friends, and he just moved onto this weekend-long cruise. Every single time that cruise begins, he is anointed by the captain. He is given a bottle of wine, and they do a celebration of Super Mario. That's what they would call him. Mario Salcedo is his name. They do a whole song and dance. He'd wave to the crowd. He was almost like the mascot. He'd say a little speech about how the cruise was the best cruise in the world, and he'd take the wine, and then he'd go after the ceremony back to his windowless cabin underneath everything else, sort of the subterranean existence. He'd put the wine bottle alongside all of the other wine bottles he'd have. He'd open up the sun chips, which were complimentary. He'd pop them in his mouth, and then he'd start watching what was on TV, which was Fox News, which he was very happy. He fought the cruise lines to get back on the ship. And so I think this idea of, look, I don't think Fox News or conservative Democrat, I don't think that has anything to do with it. I think like liberals are just as, guilty of this desire to control everything as much as someone who isn't a liberal. I think the thing that was interesting to me on that ship, though, was that this was a man who automated. He talked about eliminating non-value activities, like talking to people or, fucking doing the laundry or taking out the trash, cooking. To him, what were considered value activities were conversations where he could basically push the stop button at any point in time. And these were conversations with people that worked for him, essentially, that were fearful of him. And in that case, he was sort of like the master, the king, the cruising king. And so I see a lot of similarities between him and George. I think George is a lot. I think Mario claimed he was the happiest guy in the world. And I think in a similar way to George, there was little irony there. I think he believed it. I think with George, he was always honest with us to some degree. I mean, he would talk about his feelings. He would talk about how he was alone. And I think he was lonely and he wanted company. And I think he found it in us. But, we were sort of a captive audience for him.
Yeah.
He controlled us to a degree. He couldn't control what I put in the film, and he never asked me of that. But he always knew that anything he'd say or do, he'd have a group of people kind of fawning over him and hoping that we would keep following him.
To put King George aside for a second, I want to return to the dichotomy between Jeff and Louie. Now we've sketched out Jeff's essential problem. It was his. It killed me to watch Jeff because he was such a doormat, and I think in Jeff's wife, there's sort of like the audience point of view comes through a little bit, but in the sort of split between the two visions of of Jeff and Louie and their relationship to their idea of what work is and how work fits into their life. There's a great quote from Louie, who is, as you mentioned, sort of the more entrepreneurial, and by that I mean he has a wealthy family, but he is the more he's sort of a kettle corn impresario who has he wants to make some money moves. He wants to bring the Renaissance Fair into the 21st century by having an EDM festival there, which I think is a disgrace to historical continuity. But there's a point where he says, speaking of the appeal of Renaissance fairs, he says, it's a throwback, and it hits the emotional heart of humans. People feel like they're truly part of a village, and that's how you generate cash for the investors. But in Jeff and Louie, I see two sort of opposing but very common attitudes of American attitudes about their boss and their job. And in Jeff, he just wants to serve his boss and his job. And in Louie, he wants to take it over and has this sugar-free Red Bull enhanced sort of grind set attitude. But both of them essentially are seeking to become their job by displacing the king. And I'm wondering what you see in the American attitudes towards work and their bosses as portrayed in Ren Faire.
Man, another great fucking question. Jesus Christ. Wow. No, look, I think it's funny because ultimately this show is almost about middle management in a way, and just at least this very specific example of a workplace that, sure, it's set at a Renaissance fair, but it actually, and so maybe that's not the most relatable thing to people, but I think when you actually look at it up close, it probably bears a striking resemblance to the workplaces that many people go through. Certainly when I was an intern and, working, I used to be like a screenplay reader at a lot of different production companies. I even interned at the Weinstein Company when I was 18 years old in Los Angeles, California. And I was doing screenplay coverage on Cloud Atlas.
Nice. Good movie.
I remember the experience of being there was very similar to kind of this existence of, I don't know, of being in a culture of fear, right? I think for Jeff and Louie, their performances in this are so different. I think what Jeff ends up doing, and I think it's the most heartbreaking and fascinating thing about the whole show, is that this is a person who is a compulsive performer, and throughout the show, he's almost performing versions of his pain. He is playing to the medium of, it's almost like giving a theatrical performance, or what he would do in one of his community theater plays when he's playing Shrek and Shrek the Musical. He's taking that experience and he's converting it to being in a documentary. Not to say that what he's going through isn't real or his emotions aren't real, but the way he experiences it and even talks is so hyperbolic. And that's, I think, even when the cameras are off, that's sort of how he sees his life. I think if anything, for the two of them, because they are still at the Renaissance Fair and they are still playing the game and they are still ensnarled basically in this cycle that is never ending, I think there's this just degree of loving the place they work in, but hating the boss, maybe, or just having to, basically their love of the culture of the place will outweigh anything else. But then also ultimately at the end of the day, the thing that they become most comfortable doing, and the really only way they know, like, their relationship to work and their relationship to themselves, is when they're stuck playing this cycle. It's the most comforting thing for them at a certain point. And I think that's why they're still there. But Louie's interesting. Louie's different. I mean, look, Louie, yes, he comes from money and his parents have staked him and are investors in his business, but he could easily be the guy counting bills in the back of the kettle corn booth. He doesn't have to be in there, getting dehydrated and fucking, just drinking as many Red Bulls as he does, all that stuff. I mean, it's like he doesn't have to be grinding as hard, but he does. And in that sense, I really respect him. Like I see him as sort of he's not a man of the people from his socioeconomic background, but I think there's a reason that someone of his class is in the Ren Faire. And I think it's because at the beginning, the reason he even started, going there and working there, I think, is because he felt different than everyone else in his life. And he sort of escaped into that universe. And then I think parts of his life and the way he grew up and coming from a family of investors, I think his desire to own the place, it was almost this manifest destiny. Like, maybe my family will see something in me and see and respect me for basically taking a very capitalist view of this otherwise, non-capitalist place, at least in the origins of it, and convert it into something real. And now when you go there, I mean, look, that Renaissance Fair, and I think a lot of them, as I've seen since working on this, like you pay to play everything. I mean, you go there and you do one of those endurance, strength endurance tests where you take the hammer and you hit the fucking bell. You don't win anything for hitting the bell. If you get it, you pay $10 for it. They've monetized
to prove to everyone that you're from warrior stock.
They've monetized fucking everything there. And not to say that that's a terrible thing. I think as business people, they're shrewd. It's like almost like going to Vegas. It's like if you're going to go to Vegas and you want to have a good time, you have to spend some money. It's a similar logic.
I think there was a very telling moment, a very telling character moment with Louie, where he was describing his past before coming to the Ren Faire, and he was training to be an Air Force pilot, but then he says that didn't work out because I don't follow the rules. It was like,
it's apparently
great.
He describes basically doing a maverick move on the plane where it's clear that he did something very reckless, but the way he spins it is like, look, I was too good at flying the plane, and then they had to kick me out.
It's amazing. He's like, people don't think I can do things, but I can. I almost crashed a fucking plane and got kicked out of the Air Force, but I still pulled it off. I mean, he's incredible. I do think he's like someone. I mean, that's ultimately the reason. And again, that's the tragedy of the story, is that he will never take no for an answer. And you know what's going to happen when Jeff goes on that chocolate convention in India in a few weeks or months or whenever it is. You know what will happen is Louie will go to George exactly like he had done in this series, and exactly like Louie had done years prior to the beginning of this series, because Louie has tried to own the fair for a long time. And I just don't think it will ever happen. I think once George passes away, maybe it will be something different, I guess.
The Renaissance Fair will develop a sort of proto-industrial economy. There'll be textile factories there or something. We'll move on to the sort of a Dickensian age of cosplaying fairs. But Chris, you had a question about George as an artist that also struck me when I was watching the movie.
I have a few questions of personal preference for you, but okay, so you meet George and you see, as he said, his like Renaissance afflected Playboy mansion, and you kind of initial reaction to it is like, oh my God, look at this like gaudy monstrosity. And then like halfway through the second episode, you drop that his educational background is as a fine artist. And I feel like that makes a lot of things click into place. And I found myself having a better appreciation of kind of his aesthetic as time went on. What do you think of George as an artist?
I mean, I think he's fucking brilliant, man. I don't know what to say. Whatever, like, every time I talk to him, his new fascination is something that is totally alien to me. You see little bits of it in the first episode. He's like reading the Doll magazine, and everyone should subscribe to the Doll magazine.
Everyone should subscribe to the Doll magazine. Yeah.
I do think, look,
really stuck out of my head.
George is like a fucking auteur movie director. I don't really believe in like auteur theory, and especially right now, I feel like movies are made by teams of people, but George gives that theory some credence for its existence. Like, this is a guy. Every idea that he has is likely stolen from somewhere else, but he acknowledges it, owns it, and does his own weird, like, psychodramatic spin on it. And he has teams of illegal immigrants, Mexican employees that are working for him, that are doing the art for him. He's almost like Jeff Koons or something. I mean, he's employing teams of people to manufacture this shit for him,
And that's so ironic, because in the third episode, he goes off on a tangent about what bullshit Andy Warhol is and how all art has been bad since Andy Warhol because they're just jerking off the American public. And one of my other favorite lines, he's describing his bathroom and he says, "Rococo means overly decorated." And that's what art is meant to be. And I think it's so funny that he has such contempt for Andy Warhol and this kind of postmodern factory-like artistic collaboration and sort of playing with meaning and this kind of ironic pose to his art, because he really is, he comes across as kind of, like you said, a brilliant kind of cantankerous madman, but also a real postmodern artistic figure in this world and life he has crafted for himself.
I mean, totally. It's like, he reminds me a lot of like Howard Hughes towards the end of his life, when he just went absolutely off the reservation, but had so much money that he could basically entomb himself with, what was it, like the ice cream flavor that he was obsessed with in Vegas.
And the TV channel that only played Ice Station Zebra 24 hours a day that he bought.
I mean, it's like George. Yeah, it's very similar to George, man. He's fucking listening to the DirecTV New Age music channel as he goes. So, no,
Enya, yes, 24/7.
There's the Enya too, but there's something about him that is, I don't know. I mean, to me, it was important that in a way the film feels Rococo, right? And I think that's also why you have so many of these like overly stylized moments, like the dragon speaking to Jeff, or Jeff's sort of ego death in the first episode when people are shouting his name. I mean, I love just the sheer absurdity of like taking an absurd setting and then finding ways to emotionally, just finding ways to take real things that are happening around me and then enmesh them with events that feel, like George would say, overly decorated. And I feel like in a way that's the truest way to make a documentary. It's not to try and pretend, I just don't think, like when you asked the question earlier, I don't think it's possible to be a fly on the wall. At least for me and my crew, it's impossible to do so. And I think any person that says it is a fucking liar. And I think when you look at Frederick Wiseman's movies, and you look at the way he even talks about his movies, he doesn't say he's a fly on the wall. The way he even talks about his films, he doesn't even like calling them documentaries. He likes to call them, I know Alan King calls his films actuality films. I'm pretty sure Frederick Wiseman calls them dramas, because ultimately what he's doing in the edit and when he's shooting them is he's using the ideas of how a fiction film would be constructed, and he's employing those ideas, a structure of sorts, to the assimilation of real life. And so, look, to me, I'm just always like, I don't know if it's just because of like the Netflixification of documentaries that people have this expectation that nonfiction is supposed to inform you or educate you of something. But the thing I like and find exciting, and I just continue to think there's real opportunities to be made in doing this type of stuff, is to make something that hopefully isn't so like up its own asshole that people aren't able to engage with it emotionally, but make something that is emotionally engaging, and then hopefully by the end of it have people talk about all of the ways it's been styled and everything else. Because to me that's the reason like cinema exists. If you want to read a Wikipedia article, you can do that, but don't make me watch a movie that is a Wikipedia documentary. I don't want that, personally, at least.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question to that? How was Louie's kettle corn? Is it good enough to build an empire on?
Dude, it's delicious. It is. He calls it kettle crack. If you look it up, I'm not kidding. That's what it's actually called. The business name on Instagram and everywhere else. I mean, it's funny that it's like he's sober, but he's calling it's a drug of its own kind. It's addicting to eat that shit. I've been trying to figure out ways for the two of us to like do special screenings and get kettle crack to supply the delicious popcorn that could be there. But we'll see.
Nice. I'm following on Insta.
Okay. We talked a little bit about your The Villages film that you did, and like that is very specifically a Florida story, and you grew up in Florida. Ren Faire, what about this movie? Like, what about the plot and the characters that you discovered making this film is something that is so singular to Texas? Do you regard Ren Faire as a Texas story in the way that like the Villages film was sort of a Florida story, something that could only exist in those two specific states?
I think both Florida and Texas are united in the sense of the, like I think we were talking about like the lack of income tax and the ability for people to create empires if they want to and become, rulers of their own fantasy world. I think George is not a Texan, right? He's a Californian who went to Texas because of the cheap land and the opportunity he saw. And ultimately he was run out of California and he was run out of Salt Lake City because he didn't own the land around the fair. But I think everyone around there, and I think just the ethos of work and the sort of the desire, the dimension, I think, when I think of Texas, I think of like a real classic form of America that still exists somewhere, especially when you head outside of the more developed parts and you see, families that are entrenched in tradition. And I think one thing that George built with the fair is like, there's many mini empires that exist within his main one. And those empires are all run by families. You get little glimpses of them in the beginning, the first episode, like the Imhoffs who do the sausage on the stick, or the Giles. Like these are families that have been native to Texas for like hundreds of years, with the Imhoffs specifically.
The Greek family that tries to put together a buying claim at the end of the
they're Canadian, which is funny. But I think there's just like this, there's a real manifest destiny dimension to all of this shit that I feel like maybe is more emblematic of just like, I'm not sure if it's just Texas, but it feels just distinctly, uniquely American. Like the reason we came to America to begin with was to escape a bunch of shit that was happening, that people didn't want to do anymore. They wanted freedom.
The tyrannies of old Europe and then recreate them in a fairgrounds in Texas.
For fun and profit.
Yeah,
exactly.
For fun and profit. Yeah.
I don't know, but what do you see? I think like what Elon's doing in his universe over there, and it's not probably that dissimilar to the world that George is creating. And so I feel like there's a reason he's in Texas too. I don't know. Do you see something deeper?
Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, like, I just see, like, the back to this idea of, like, this sort of prototypical American character who's sort of like part con man, part genius, sort of half smart but has a dream. And watching all 3 episodes of this, I was just struck by like George is sort of like McCabe from McCabe and Miss Miller if the mining company didn't kill him and he was allowed to just run a whorehouse in Washington State. He could have been the king. He was the king of that. And I don't know. I just found like a very distinctly American story and character in George. And like, yeah, the Texas aspect of it was like, yeah, like you say he quotes the Walt Disney book where like Walt Disney's advice for creating any kind of like imaginary realm of which you were the king of is just incorporate it as its own town to be like, to get away from the tyranny and bureaucracy of the state, just become the state. And you can do that in a country or in a state like Texas where there is just so much fucking land and
so little state.
That is so little state. Yeah.
You can kind of do whatever you want. Yeah. It's I mean, I love that about George too, though. And, you know, in the sense that like one person there once said this, that George is he's like a businessman, he's an artist, and he's a burnout. He's all 3 people combined into kind of this, you know, and very few people will ever be on the same wavelength as he is, because when he speaks business to an artist, they probably won't get it. When he's speaking art to a business person, they probably won't get it. And when he's speaking about like things that are far out or just things that come from like the kind of dropout culture that he also grew up in, and the desire to be known and loved by his family and seen as a great artist and all these things that he never got when he was younger.
Reading every popular science book all at once and taking them all as literally true, apparently.
I mean, yeah, well, you know, he wrote a book, or he had a book ghost written called Mind Wars, How I Overcame Dementia. But
How I Overcame Dementia?
Yeah, he says that through meditation.
Send a copy of that to Joe Biden.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if George ever had dementia. I mean, if he did and he overcame it, then, you know, whatever he discovered needs to be broadcast to the world. But, you know, the guy, for all of the ways in which he acts erratically, he does have a surprisingly good memory, and he uses the appearance of being a feeble elderly man to his advantage. And because he loves to reveal like the trump card, you know, he pulls it out, you know, whips it out right when you least expect it. He will fucking kill you if you
don't have that marketing plan ready. Yeah,
you know, he will eat you alive. And he's still more in control than I think any other person is, and really in control of his own life in a way that probably very few people are. That's why Jeff is right. A lot of millionaires, very few self-made kings.
And ultimately, the latter is more impressive than being a millionaire. If you can make yourself a king, because most people, they're just born that way. They just fall out of the right woman, and that's it. But King George, we hail to you. Lance Oppenheim, the series is Ren Faire, available to stream everywhere now. Please check it out. It is very funny and fascinating.